Okay, I think we can declare at 10:15 and begin to deal with the Chicago School in its relationship to the Austrian School. And I want to cover several different broad areas in methodology and theories and some of the policies and so on, and try to get at the key differences between Hayek and Friedman, or between Vienna and Chicago generally, and give you some insights into why, for instance, Friedman just doesn't have much use for the Austrian school. He's never warmed up to it. He's always been very critical, even dismissive of it. And I think we'll be able to see why in this presentation. Also, let me just ask, how many of you yesterday listened to Tom Wood's lecture on doing economic history? Did a lot of you? Okay, I think you'll see some correspondence there that wasn't planned or intended, and when I heard his lecture, I realized that he was feeding into mine fairly substantially, and helps me some. And for those of you who didn't hear it, well, we'll fill in the blanks as we go along. I want to begin with a comparison, sort of a three-way comparison, to sort of set the stage and show you the relationships between three schools of thought, which includes Keynes. And I've tried to give a very, very brief but to the point discussion of each of the three so you can see what's going on. Keynes, as you know, theorizes at a high level of aggregation, and he argued that market economies perform perversely. Actually, I've sort of built into his presuppositions about how the economy works, especially in the market mechanisms that are supposed to bring saving and investment in balance with one another. You've seen that in the earlier shows that I've done. So seeing unemployment and resource idleness as the norm, he called for counter-cyclical fiscal and monetary policies, and ultimately for a comprehensive socialization of investment. And you see that phrase in quote, comprehensive socialization of investment, that's drawn directly from his swan song chapter, chapter 24, where Keynes comes unbuttoned and lets you know what he's all about. Okay, that he thinks the only solution to our employment problem is for the government to assume the role of determining the level of investment. Now, let's look at Friedman and look at that first expression, high level of aggregation. Let's switch to Friedman, and we see that his theory is based on a still higher level of aggregation. You might think that he would disaggregate some to see what's going on. No, he aggregates more. I think we could argue that Keynes aggregated so much that he couldn't see the market solution to the problem. But he didn't aggregate so much that he lost sight of the problem. And what Friedman did is he aggregated a little more and lost sight of the problem. Okay? So he doesn't worry about his solution because he doesn't see the problem. So Friedman was, his theory is based on a still higher level of aggregation, as represented by this equation of exchange. I'm sure most of you know what that is, but MV equal PQ. I put a little code there in the picture. It's just the quantity of money times its velocity of circulation, how much monetary spending is there, and PQ is the price level multiplied by real GDP, the output of the economy. In other words, it's two views of the same thing, all the goods and services that get bought and sold. The MV looks at it from the money side, how much got spent on it, and the PQ looks at it from the real side, how much junk got sold and what price on average. Those two things have to be equal. It's tautological. You couldn't imagine them not being equal. In fact, the equation itself is the definition of the velocity of money. How do you figure out velocity? Well, you divide PQ by M. You got it, okay? So it's tautological. And it makes use of an all-inclusive output variable, Q. Some of the old British economists called it O for output, but it looked like zero, I guess, so you put a little tick mark there so you know it's not a zero. Well, it's a Q, okay, the quantity of output, you could say. And that puts into eclipse the whole issue of the allocation of resources between current consumption and investment for the future. So whereas Keynes at least separated those two, you had C and you had I, they differed just in terms of the stability properties. C was a stable function of income, and I was wild, animal spirits and all that. And Friedman's presumptions was, well, it's not so wild. It's maybe a little wilder than C, but not so wild. So just lump them together, call it Q, and go on with our macroeconomics. Friedman, though, saw no problem emerging from the market itself, and he's very market-oriented. He thinks markets work. And in fact, he thinks they work so well, even in this sense, that you don't need to include them in your macro theory. That's really that's a micro topic. That's what micro people worry about. How much peanut butter and how much bubble gum and how much investment and how much consumption. That's a micro topic. We're macroeconomists. We deal with the whole thing, Q. Okay. So that's the monetarism. So he saw no problem. So he focused on the relationship between the government-controlled money supply, that's M, and the overall price level, P. Okay, and we'll see that's inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. We'll see that crop up shortly. Now, in this sense, the way I'm showing things here, it turns out that Hayek is sort of an in-betweener. He sort of splits the difference between Friedman and Keynes. Some Austrians aren't very comfortable with that. They want to be way out there on a fringe. We're the radical out there, way out there. Well, they are in a lot of ways, in a lot of senses. But on this point, they're in-betweeners. In other words, they see that there is a certain vulnerability of the market that links saving and investment. But it'll work if you let it work. But if you monkey around with the interest rate, it won't work. Okay, it's vulnerable to intervention of that sort. So capital-based macro is distinguished by its propitious disaggregation. I'll make my students look up the word propitious. Well chosen, okay? Well chosen disaggregation, which brings into view both the problem of intertemporal resource allocation and the potential for a market solution. So at least you've got prospects for a solution to a problem that you do recognize, vulnerability to policy disorders. So Hayek showed that a coordination of saving and investment decisions could be achieved by market-governed movements in the interest rate. He also recognized that this aspect of the market economy is especially vulnerable to the manipulation of interest rates by the central bank. Well, that's the whole Austrian theory, isn't it? If the central bank leaves it alone, those interest rates will work out. If the central bank manipulates, well, you're going to have a saving investment coordination problem, and it's going to manifest itself as boom and bust. Okay, so on this front, just a brief summary, we have the Austrians between the Keynes and the monetarists. Now, if we look at a methodological reckoning, what we see is a strong alliance, if not sameness, between, guess who, Friedman and Keynes, and they're paired against the Austrians. So here the Austrians are out front, or radicals as you normally think of them as being. And I draw my text here from a book by Alan Meltzer. He wrote a very good book on Keynes's economics in 1988. And he described Keynes in methodological terms. Look what he said. Keynes was the type of theorist who developed his theory after he had developed a sense of the relative magnitudes and of the size and frequency of changes in these magnitudes. Now, this is what Tom Woods was talking about yesterday. To sort of look around without any theory to start with. Just look around first and see what magnitudes seem to be moving. You're looking for big macro magnitudes, and you're seeing which ones are moving the most and moving the most frequently. Okay, and you identify them, and what do you think it is? Well, it's consumption, it's investment, it's income, and so on. Okay, those are your building blocks. And you'll make a theory out of that. And then he goes on, this is still Meltzer talking, so he concentrated on those magnitudes that change the most, often assuming that others remain fixed or for the relevant period. And the example of that would be the internal structure of the structure of production. In other words, when he looked around to see what moved the most, what he didn't see was relative changes within the structure brought about by movements in the interest rates. Those are hard to discern by the naked eye. Okay, he didn't see those. So they weren't building blocks of his theory. They were assumed not to change. Again, this comes from Meltzer. And then I added, this is my statement here, further, Keynes evidently did not develop a sense of what was going on within the macro magnitudes, and hence felt quite justified in ignoring all such issues. So he didn't worry about what was going on with inside the investment magnitude, such as stages of production, differential interest rate sensitivities, and that sort of thing. That's Keynes. Now, you might think we'll have a contrast here with Friedman, but we don't. We have an endorsement. And so here's Friedman, and this comes from, let's see where it comes from, Keynes' Political Legacy, an 86 publication. Friedman says, I believe that Keynes' theory is the right kind of theory in its simplicity, its concentration on a few key magnitudes, and its potential fruitfulness. And if you understand Friedman, if you know Friedman, potential fruitfulness means a theory for which there is data available to run the numbers with. Okay, that's what makes it fruitful. Friedman is on record as saying we're all Keynesians now. He complained that he was being misinterpreted, and so he clarified by saying that we all use the Keynesian language and apparatus. Of course, we all meant he and the Keynesians. It excluded the Austrians. Okay, we don't use that apparatus. Got our own apparatus. Sorry. And so here, Friedman is signing on with the Keynesians. Now, he went on to say, you know, that's the sense in which we're all Keynesians now. Well, what's the sense in which Friedman is not a Keynesian? And that is the substantive claims he makes about just how those movements go relative to one another. And it's in this sense that if you want to give Friedman some credit, and you should, I do, I give him a lot of credit, and you give him credit for beating Keynes at his own game. Partly he was favored because he had the data. If you read Keynes, this was before national income accounts were set up. Well, of course, they were set up on the basis of trying to figure out what the numbers were that Keynes was talking about. But when Keynes wrote, he would write things like, if we had the data, they would show, and he explained what the data would show. He didn't have the data, okay? Because Simon Kuznets hadn't set up the accounting system in America, and Richard Stone, a former assistant to Keynes, hadn't set up the accounting system in Britain. But they did set those up, and then Friedman came along. Friedman initially was a statistician, if you know his story. And wow, he's got all the numbers now. And so he can see what the data shows. So Friedman is there to say, okay, Maynard, we've got the data, and they don't show any such thing. They show something quite different, all the monetarist propositions. And Friedman was enormously successful theoretically, empirically, politically, in that counter-revolution, as it was called. To spot him mad. Now, Hayek, and here I'm drawing from an article that I wrote, the role of the economist, Hayek points out in his Pure Theory of Capital, this is one of the important things in Pure Theory of Capital, is precisely to identify the features of the market process that are hidden from the untrained eye. Okay? Now think about how different that is from Keynes. I mean, Keynes arrives on the scene and sort of gawks around to see what's moving and what's moving the fastest and the most frequently. He's looking for what you can see even with an untrained eye, and then he's trying to theorize based on those magnitudes. And Hayek said, well, no, that's not the job of the economist. We want to look for forces at work that wouldn't ordinarily be seen unless you already have an idea about what the market process is all about. For Hayek, the cause and effect relationship between central bank policy during the boom and the subsequent economic downturn have a first-order claim on our attention, despite the more salient co-movements in macroeconomic magnitudes that characterize the post-downturn spiraling of the economy into deep depression. So Hayek was certainly aware that once we got the downturn and once we got some perverse economic policies, that the economy went south big time, and it went south fast, and it stayed there for 10 years. He knows that, okay? And if you're just doing a macroeconomic history of the period, you want to take all those things into account. But if you want to understand how we got in the mess in the first place, you need to go back and look at the seeds that were shown during the 20s that gave rise to this, and that's what Hayek is doing. So Hayek is not in a position of beating Keynes or Friedman, for that matter, at their own game, because he's not playing that game. That's not his game. His game is to look before the crash to see what was going on that helps us understand why we had the crash in the first place. And this is from his Nobel lecture, which actually is aimed at Keynes, but it applies just as well to Friedman, as you might guess, because Friedman and Keynes are alike in this sense. And here Hayek says there may well exist better, quote, scientific evidence. And what he means is empirically demonstrated regularities among key macroeconomic magnitudes for a false theory, which will be accepted because it is more, quote, scientific, as a sort of sneer quotes about scientific, than for a valid explanation which is rejected because there is no significant quantitative evidence for it. You see, when I talk to monetarists or Keynesians for that matter, they essentially challenge me to produce the evidence, produce the correlations that will trump their correlations. Okay, well that's not the name of the game here. It's subtle things going on during the 20s in terms of misallocation within the structure that gave rise to the downturn. This pretense of knowledge was the printed version. That's the title of his Nobel lecture in 1974. To emphasize, you get a difference in focus out of this. And I mentioned this the other day in a slightly different connection. And that is that there's the two issues here that are being juggled, and sometimes people slough over the difference between these two issues. And one is the question of why there was a downturn, and the second one was why the downturn in 1929 degenerated in such a long and lasting depression. Why did good times turn bad? That's a question that Hayek has an answer for. Why were those bad times so awfully bad? And that's a question that takes a lot of good economic history to ferret out, all the perverse policies, and we talked about that the other day. So Keynes attributes the downturns to psychological factors. See, he's not even drawing on economics to explain why there was a downturn. It's psychological factors, loss of fire in the belly, the animal spirits, loss of confidence, okay, and so on, affecting the investment community. His main focus, however, is on the dynamics of the subsequent downward spiral and on the policies that will reverse the spiral's direction. That's where you get the multiplier effect, and you need the stimulus package to turn it around and get the multiplier working in the other way. Okay, all independent of just why it was that you're down there in the first place. Well, talk to the psychology professor about that, because Keynes is more worried about the spiraling down and spiraling back up. If you look at Friedman, Friedman too is dismissive of the whole issue of the cause of the downturn. One thing I've become sensitive to is the terminology, the phraseology, and I've been making a tabulation of the different terms, referring to the downturn as an ordinary or run-of-the-mill or routine or garden variety recession. I'm sorry, if you're a macroeconomist, you shouldn't be able to get away with that. Okay, a macroeconomist ought to be able to explain why there are recessions, what causes a downturn. But Friedman doesn't, or the monetarist in general doesn't. It was just a routine recession. It was just an ordinary downturn. And then all sorts of bad things happen, and that's what he wants to focus on, okay? His focus is on policy blunders after the downturn and the correlation between the decrease in the money supply and the fall in nominal GDP, that is PQ, the other side of that equation of exchange, because that's what he has the data for, okay? He doesn't have the data on the blunders. Those are just stories that you tell. And in fact, he doesn't even have great stories. One story is simply that the Federal Reserve blundered. Well, of course, it's a government agency. It's government's blunder. QED. In Free to Choose, he actually blames the blundering or the downturn of the economy on some anti-Semitic views of the Federal Reserve in not wanting to bail out banks in New York City. I don't think that's it. Okay, I mean, there may have been some anti-Semitism there, but I don't think that's certainly not the economist's explanation of what was going on. Now, let's look at Hayek. He focuses on the policy-infected aspects of the boom and their implications for the boom's sustainability. He leaves it to the economic historian to detail all of the policy perversities and hard times that characterize the subsequent depression. All right? And that lines up with my story when I talked about the Great Depression. And it just shows that they have different answers, mainly because they have different questions. Friedman and Keynes had the same question, but Keynes didn't have the data and Friedman did. It counts for the difference, okay? And the difference between Hayek on the one hand and Friedman Keynes on the other, they're asking different questions. But I think Hayek's question is a more important one. I think he has a good answer for it. Let's look at Friedman's monetarism very briefly here. MV equal PQ. You see that in every textbook. It gets a workout and so on. And essentially, given the time he was writing, he was more interested in explaining inflation than deflation. More interested in explaining what was going on in the 50s and 60s rather than how the Depression worked. But he turned his analysis to the issue of the Depression in his monetary history that he wrote with Anna Schwartz. So velocity, it turns out, has a mild upward trend. It's so mild, I'm not going to worry with it. It's just, we'll just call it V. It is what it is. And over a relatively short period of time, say 3 to 5 years, something like that, output is growing pretty slowly. You don't get doubling and quadrupling of output. You get low single-digit output increases, and we'll ignore those too for the time being. We'll factor them in the next slide, probably. So with those two assumptions in play, then the price level moves with the money supply. Well, duh. I mean, look at the equation. It has to. If V doesn't change and Q doesn't change, then M and P go together. In fact, that's the basis. There's M going up and there's P going up. It turns out that the cause and effect relationship that Friedman argues for, and correctly I think, although the empirics won't get it for him, is that it's M that causes P. In other words, it's not the case, as some politicians would have you believe, that the Fed pumps up the money supply so you can afford these higher prices, okay? No, it's the other way around. You have higher prices because the Fed's pumping up the money supply. But that happens with a lag, and a substantial lag. And Friedman's term for it is long and variable. There's a long and variable lag. You get the idea in reading Friedman that even he is a little bit puzzled by how long it is. Why would it take up to 30 months? That's 2.5 years. Why would it take up to 2.5 years for more money to show up fully as higher prices? And we'll see at the end of the show that he deals with that issue and deals in a way that will leave you scratching your head, I think. We'll see how that works. So there's the long and variable lag. So that's monetarism, and you start with the tautology, MV does equal PQ, and then you sort of dress it up about what we've established doesn't change much. Many a dissertation was written at the University of Chicago to show that in a particular country over a particular time period, velocity didn't change. You'd get a PhD by showing that at that time. Pick your country, pick your time period, go to work. Okay, you can defend in 18 to 30 months or something. So that's the way it worked. Now, this is where his famous quote comes out of a 1968 book called Dollars and Deficits. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Spot Friedman that one, and of course Mises wouldn't disagree, nor Hayek. Might disagree about how you should define inflation. But what's meant there is price level inflation, is price inflation. In the modern literature, if it says inflation, it means increasing prices. Okay, and now we get Friedman's monetary rule, and again, see his focus is just on these aggregates. So he does recognize that output does increase over time, 3 to 5%, something like that, 3 or 4%. It doesn't increase much, low single digits. So increase the money supply at a slow and steady rate to achieve long-run price level constancy. In other words, no inflation means price level is not changing in Friedman. And so here's the idea that, look, we know the economy does grow in real terms. And if you want price level stability, he would say means constancy, then you need to increase the money supply by about that same rate. A small adjustment for the fact that velocity changes a little too. Yes?
Was it part of it?
Yeah, fixed and foreknown rate. And of course it could become known just because you keep doing it. That's what you keep doing. But yeah, it's supposed to be something people could count on, and the Fed could maintain its reputation by sticking to it. But the norm actually of keeping the price level constant, he just accepted that he said with a long tradition of the view that we need a constant price level. That's how you do it. Now, the question we can ask, having read some, so you get no change in the price level. Yeah, we get it. But what happens within the Q aggregate as a result of the monetary injection? And here, Friedman is oblivious. He just doesn't look at it. Doesn't matter. Keynes was oblivious, and so on. And yet, you know what the story is. I mean, even if you're increasing the money supply just enough to keep the price level from falling, you're still increasing it by pumping it out through credit markets, and you're depressing interest rates. And when you depress interest rates, you cause a misallocation within the structure of production. You can show that. You've seen that diagram before. So what Hayek argued, and argued in the late 20s, when he was at NYU as a visiting fellow and watching the Federal Reserve at the time at close range. And he was watching what they were doing. They were increasing the money supply, and he was arguing that this would cause trouble. In fact, he started to write a dissertation at NYU, never finished it, but he got the title, okay? And the title was a question, and it was a question: is artificial price level stabilization consistent with sustainable growth? Okay, that's what he was asking. Artificial price level stabilization. And of course his answer is no, because you're pumping up the money supply, falsifying interest rates, misallocating resources within the structure of production. Now, here's Friedman in reverse. In other words, look at the monetary contraction. And it's the same equation, okay, MV equal PQ. So a sharp monetary contraction puts downward pressure on P and Q. You see, first you start out this way, you say, okay, and if P is slow to adjust, then Q will fall pretty dramatically. So as far as what the equation tells you, let me do it up here first. If M goes down and V doesn't change, and actually when V does change, it's reinforcing it will go down too, because if a depression gets underway, people start piling up cash, and that lowers the velocity of money. But all he can say, for starters, is that there's downward pressure on P times Q. Now, which falls? Does P fall or does Q fall? Well, of course, it's logical that if one doesn't fall much, the other one falls a whole bunch. And then he goes to the evidence. Evidence shows that decreasing M is the essential or primary or dominant cause of the decrease in Q. Okay? So that's his theory of the depression. And by theory of the depression, he means what is it that explains, or at least is empirically consistent with, the huge fall of output from 1929 to 1933. And this is it. Now, one thing I suggested the other day in talking about the Great Depression, he probably oversells that idea simply because we know at least a few reasons why prices weren't falling. It's because Hoover and Roosevelt were trying everything they could do to keep them from falling. If they hadn't done those things, then prices would have fallen at least more than they actually did, and the depression wouldn't have been as severe or so long-lasting. But you can see how Hayek doesn't consider this an answer at all, or it's an answer to a different question. The G. Friedman, this is an answer to the question of why the depression got so deep. We want to know what caused it in the first place. Friedman's not asking that question, so obviously he's not answering it. I had some give and take with Lanny Evenstein. Have you read some of his book? He's written 2 biographies of Friedman, or of Hayek, and one of Friedman. and he and I have gone at it about this issue, and I've had the most difficult time getting him to see the difference in the questions being asked, as opposed to simply the empirical evidence on magnitude during the Great Depression. And in a recent email, I sent him a case of the cabbage-eating Mississippi monster. Let's sort of take this out of the context of monetary theory and see if I can get the idea across. And it goes like this. We suppose that in late October of 1929, you know what happened then, a 1,000-pound monster showed up in Mississippi. It spent the next 3.5 years eating all the cabbages and quite a few rabbits between Jackson and Pascagoula. Okay? By early March of 33, that's when the Depression bottomed out, by the way, the monster had weighed 4,000 pounds. You know, 1,000-pound monster, 4,000-pound monster. Okay. So 2 investigators are sent to Mississippi to get a handle on the situation. One's from Vienna and one's from Chicago. Now, I deliberately stacked the cards against the Viennese investigator, but at least he asked the right questions. Where in the world did this hideous thing come from? I cleaned up the prose there a little bit for this presentation. Where this thing come from? So I seem to have stacked the cards against the Austrians. Hard to imagine an insightful answer to this question, unless, of course, the monster turns out to be an unintended consequence of some ill-conceived government-sponsored bionics project, which it probably did. And in fact, if you're sci-fi fans, especially, I like sci-fi, especially bad ones. And there's a remake of The Blob. You remember The Blob? Blob 1 was 1958. It was good, too. And then it was remade in 1988. And in 88, they changed the storyline a little bit, in which The Blob actually was exactly that. It was an unintended consequence of the ill-conceived government project, okay? In fact, I call that the monetarist blob, and not the other was a Keynesian blob. But anyhow, that's the Viennese investigator. Now, what does a Chicago person say? Okay, here comes a guy from Chicago. The Chicagoan shows up, shoves the Austrian aside, and says, "Never mind how this thing got here. The real question is, how did it grow from 1,000 pounds to 4,000 pounds? How did an ordinary run-of-the-mill garden variety monster quadruple his weight in 40 months? That's the real question. In monetarist literature, real question means question for which you've got some data to work with, okay? And so, the Chicagoan answer, of course, is it was all those cabbages. Couldn't get good data on the rabbits. So the correlation between cabbage consumption and weight gain leaves no doubt on the issue, right? That's the Chicago answer, and he challenged the Austrians. You know, okay, what's your answer? How do you explain it if it's not all those cabbages? Yeah. Yeah, it is, but it's a question or it's an answer to a different question, and then once you've got that question, there are a whole bunch of answers, and this is part of it. In other words, it also had to do with propping up the prices, had to do with the Smoot-Hawley tariff, had to do with make-work projects, had to do with profits tax and social. You know, had a lot of different factors made the Depression as bad as it was. But however good that question is, and however good the cabbage answer is, it doesn't deal with what I think of and Hayek thought of as the more fundamental question: where did this thing come from anyhow? Okay. And here I just suggest that maybe data availability is what led the Chicagoan to his conclusion, and the lack of hard data pertaining to the monster's origin caused him to be dismissive of questions about where the thing came from. Okay, so these, I say, are the related suspicions, or what underlie the message in Hayek's Nobel address, the pretense of knowledge. Yeah, lazy. Okay, well, well. I wouldn't make that charge. I mean, if you know Friedman, if you know his personal history, he was anything but lazy. Just rating him as an individual, anything but lazy. But he did come at it with as a statistician. He thought he was going to be an actuary before he got into economics. So I think he just brought tools with him that gave him these kinds of answers. Pardon? Well, could be. I've got some more evidence here that we'll see if you hold that view or change it a little bit. Running a little short of time, but I can't resist telling this one story. I had the occasion, I spent about 15 months in Menlo Park before I came to Auburn. Menlo Park's close to Stanford. I used the Stanford Library. Friedman was there at the Hoover Institution. And so I walked through the parking lot every day, and I did know how important MV equal PQ was to Friedman at the time. And evidence was that California, which was the first state, by the way, to have vanity license plate, his license number was, can you guess it? MV equal PQ. That's sort of a modern thing. Older economists used to have their favorite equations on their headstones. But MV equal PQ. And I always wanted to use that in class. And then a friend of mine sent me a picture of Friedman in his Eldorado Cadillac with MV equal PQ. But it was tabloid. It didn't scan well. And besides, I lost it. Okay. And so, but I wanted to give what I call an attendance question in class. This is for one of my exams. And so, the equation of exchange is so near and dear to Milton Friedman's heart. And so you have to think of the 3 wrong answers, of course. Made his wife Rose promise it will be a tasteful appearance on his headstone. That's no other economists have done that. Spelled it out in pansies in the flower garden of the Hoover Institution. Written a parody to the popular YMCA to memorialize the equation and song. I had a couple of students that tried that, and it was pretty good. I couldn't get them to perform it in class, and adopted it as his vanity license plate for his Cadillac Eldorado. Okay. So there are the 4. Now, it turns out I wanted this picture, and I couldn't get it. And so I made it up. That's it. I'll show you right here. Okay. It's a 70 Cadillac. Okay, red with a white top. I don't think Friedman would have driven it. But there it is, MV equal PQ. So I showed this to the class. Because, see, it was supposed to be an attendance question, so I wanted them to see the picture. All right. And then later, I'm an honest guy. I fessed up that I'd made the whole thing up. But then, still later, I had a friend of mine who knew of my problem with the Cadillac. He sent me an email to a link to a French site, a French language site. Okay, he said there was a picture of the Cadillac there. Let's see. Why can't it get the internet? Is that right? Okay. Well, that puts a damper on my story, but I can tell you the story. If you pull up this French site, and you find the picture and click on it, guess what? It's that picture. Okay, they cribbed it off of my site. Yeah, they cribbed it off of my site. Now, but it goes on. You recognize him, Mankiw? He showed up on Meets Press, but he runs a blog, and for some reason or other, well, we could guess why. Can you identify my car? How can you identify it? And that's what he teaches, EC10. Is it at MIT? Is that where he is? Harvard, yeah, Harvard. Can you imagine as a grown-up economist been chairman of the council? So he gets this tag, and then he photographs it and puts it on his website. I don't know. Maybe had his grad assistant photograph it. But it gave rise to some discussion on the blog. He says, I hate to spoil things, but I must say Friedman has a better plate. And then he has this little excerpt from an article years ago, trying to find Friedman's apartment in San Francisco. I knew I was at the right location when I spotted a car with a license plate that read MV equal PT. That's the old Fisher equation. T means transactions. It's a different equation. So it's not quite the right equation. Somebody else writes, no, it's not MV equal PT. It's MV equal PQ. Here's the picture. It's the French side, okay? So it's nice to be in play here, all the time. And it mainly goes to show that you can't believe anything you find on the internet. It just works that way. Well, some people didn't appreciate it, but other people did, I love economists. And somebody was showing this a while ago. So here is an actual picture that the original guy that actually he had just sent me a photocopy of the tabloid print. He sent me the whole tabloid in, and this is what I was able to scan in. But if you look at the French site, it has the picture, and it has sort of sneeringly says it looks like somebody has dubbed in that equal sign, you know. And it's kind of put, I thought, well, that's a put down. No, it's a compliment. I manufactured the whole thing. Okay. So they didn't catch it, the rest. But Friedman dubbed in the equal sign, and frankly, I think mine looks better. Okay. Mine looks better. Plus, he's got the wrong equation. Y is nominal income. Monetarists use lowercase income for real income. So, it's really wrong. He's got the right side in dollar squared. Friedman is a very persuasive guy, but I can see him down at the Department of Motor Vehicles. No, I have to have a lowercase y. Now, why he didn't just use M equal PQ, I don't know. But sure enough, that's what he did. Okay. Now, I want to show you, there's several articles. One has this exact title and others are in the spirit. What's left of monetarism? And the answer, I think, is M equal PQ. It does, you know, it's tautology, but MV does equal PQ. And it turns out, though, that for the monetary rule to work, velocity has to be constant, or nearly so. And that used to be the case. If you look at, there is inflation, a rising consumer price index, and there is the money supply. And if you look at the early years, you know, in this range down here, sure enough, there's a pretty close, you know, they look a lot alike. But you get in the later years and you lose the relationship. Brad DeLong, who I've done battle with in the literature over the Austrian theory, he plotted velocity and showed that it went silly, starting in the early 80s. And what happened in the early 80s? Well, you had some re-regulations and a phasing out of so-called regulation Q. That Q is not the Q in MV equal PQ. It's just the Qth regulation of the Federal Reserve System. And that regulation forbade the payment of interest on checking accounts and forbade the writing of checks on saving accounts. So it created a black and white distinction, a knee of the curve, so to speak, between what's money and what's not money. This is money and that's saving. We'll draw the line right here. And regulation Q will keep it crisp. And that's what allowed for that sharp or that close relationship that Friedman was counting on in the relatively constant V. So velocity became unstable in 1980 because people would shift back and forth between money and savings, write checks on savings, draw interest on checking, and so on. It was a blurry, you didn't know what M was, and so on. That's when the Fed abandoned money supply targeting and started on interest rate targeting because they thought they could manage that better. They couldn't. But. So I call this the irony of monetarism. The monetary rule that allows the economy to perform at its laissez-faire best, according to Friedman, presupposes a central piece of intervention, namely regulation Q, that makes the money supply operationally definable. All right, so I see that as kind of ironic. You need that little regulation, and then you can employ a monetary rule. This was the period where Greenspan said in a very forlorn tone, we just don't know what money is anymore, okay? And this was when he was chairman of the Fed and testifying before Congress. And that line even made it onto the Jay Leno show about chairman of the Fed saying he didn't know what money was anymore. And Leno was saying, oh, gee, you know, I'm not sure what the qualifications are for somebody to head up the Fed, but at least, you know, they ought to know what money is. This is a bare minimum. Also, to implement the monetary rule, you need some fixed and known commercial bank operating ratios. And here, I'll show you what's going on. This is deposits and reserves. And if you know anything about banking, you know that banks hold relatively low levels of reserves. The Austrians talk a lot about that, certainly below 10%, but it doesn't change much over time. So when I plot reserves, it'll be around 40 billion, 50 billion comes along in here. And look how stable it is. And then see if you can detect right in here around September of 08, See if you can detect a variation from what it had been doing. Here's reserves. There's reserves. That's reserves. Oh, okay. So that's when the Fed bought all the toxic assets and tried to pump money in. Well, let's look at deposits, and we need is a strong relationship between reserves and deposits. So this is deposit money. Oh, not much. Okay. And so it's just a phenomenal period now where we've got reserves higher than deposits. Banks are holding about more than $2 reserves for every dollar they have in deposits, 200% reserve level. Or if you plot it just in terms of the reserve ratio, it goes like that. Okay, it's a wild thing, and it's what Bernanke testified before Congress just a couple of weeks ago, explaining what the strategy was in getting all these reserves out of the system before they caused a pretty hideous inflation. Now, here's the thing about how Friedman accounted for the long and variable lag, and sort of evidence that he was concerned about it. So clear back in his 1969 volume that held a bunch of his old articles in it, he addressed the problem of the lag. He says, okay, it's changes in the money supply that cause inflation, and there's this long lag, and the textbook explanation and Friedman's own explanation in other places is that people have to adjust to the inflation. They have to straighten out their perceptions about what the real wage is or about what real prices are and so on. But that sort of leaves you cold. Say, well, does it take them 18 to 30 months to do that? It seems like it wouldn't take that long. It seemed that way to Friedman too, so there must be something else at work. Well, Friedman, he didn't have any capital theory. He was at Chicago, and so was Frank Knight. Frank Knight had a real plunky capital theory where he just talked about stocks, like machines that last forever, stocks on the one hand, and flows, that's the services they provide. So the whole Chicago mindset, to the extent they talked about capital, it was stocks and flows, or sometimes assets. That's just a stock, a real stock of capital. Sometimes Friedman would say sources. If he says sources, that means a source of a flow. That's a big machine that doesn't wear out. Okay, sources and services. That's stock and flow. It's just a two-way distinction. They get it from Frank Knight. So here's Friedman, and see what it reminds you of. He's talking about people who are holding cash after the money supply has been increased. So holders of cash will bid up the prices of assets. Okay. If the extra demand is initially directed at a particular class of assets, say government securities or commercial paper or the like, the result will be to pull prices of such assets out of line with other assets and thus widen the area into which the extra cash spills. The increased demand will sooner or later affect equities, houses, durable producers' goods, durable consumer goods, and so on, though not necessarily in that order. These effects can be described as operating on interest rates, he puts it in quotes. If a more cosmopolitan, and that's my, i.e. Austrian, interpretation of interest rates is adopted than the usual one which refers to a small range of marketable securities. All right, so he's saying that there may be this interest rate effect. And then he goes on to explain what that interest rate effect does. The key feature of this process, during which interest rates are low, is that it tends to raise the prices of sources. That's long-term capital, that's machines, okay, early stage production, of both producer and consumer services relative to the prices of the services themselves. It therefore encourages the production of such sources, early stage, and at the same time the direct acquisition of services rather than of sources. That's the overconsumption. So he's got early stage investment and overconsumption going on. But these reactions, in their turn, tend to raise the price of services relative to prices of services. That's the self-reversing effect. That is to undo the initial effects of the interest rate. The final result may be a rise in expenditures in all directions without any change in the rate of interest at all. Interest rates and asset prices may simply be a conduit through which the effect of monetary changes is transmitted to expenditures without being altered at all. So essentially he's saying we understand the lag by all of this all going on with changing prices of capital and so on and interest rates and so on. Well, yeah, but that's the nub of the misallocation during the business cycle. And he even puts some bones on it here, saying it may be that monetary expansion induces someone within 2 or 3 months to contemplate building a factory, within 4 or 5 to draw up plans, within 6 or 7 to get construction started. The actual construction may take another 6 months, and much of the effect on the income stream may come still later, insofar as the initial goods used in construction are withdrawn from inventories and only subsequent lead to increased expenditure by suppliers. So this is amazing to me. I mean, he really is setting out that whole Austrian theory, but a theory that he uses only to describe why the lag is so long. But of course, that's just illogical to say that the real cause is, simply money and output, while the reason it takes so long is all of this misallocation going on during the period. And I may skip this next part, but because I think I've got an idea of why Friedman is so resistant to the Austrian theory. I was at a conference, in fact it was a Meltzer conference, we had about 16 economists and it included Friedman, and during one of the lunch breaks, we were standing around in a small circle of people, and Friedman was talking about how difficult it is to read Dennis Robertson, Banking in the Price Levels, Robertson's book. Robertson was told it was difficult when he published it, and in the foreword, Robertson recommended the reader read each chapter twice before going on to the next chapter. Friedman said that book is very difficult to read. And then Friedman turned to me and pointed. I don't like to be pointed at by Friedman. Pointed, he said, "I'll tell you another book that's impossible to read." He said, "Hayek's Prices and Production." He said, "I challenge you to read that book and tell me what's in it." Okay, so he really just found it opaque. He couldn't make anything of it. Now, you might wonder, well, why didn't he make some effort, to get away from Knightian capital theory and learn capital theory? Well, I know. I have an explanation for that. And that is that Rose Friedman, his wife, was a fellow student of his. She was a PhD candidate too. She never finished, but she was a PhD candidate too. She was writing a dissertation on capital theory under Frank Knight. And she spent years writing that theory, well after they had left Chicago. She never finished it, but years and years writing that theory. Now, I know a number of couples who are both economists. It's kind of sad, really. My wife's a flutist. I don't tell her how to play the flute, and it works out great. But they were both economists, and all the couples I know who stayed together, one of the keys was they stay out of each other's area of specialization. Okay? If they don't stay out of each other's specialization, they don't stay together. Now, so here's one place where the Austrians can be empirical. Friedman, Rose and Milton stayed together the whole time, okay? Which means that they stayed out of one another's area of specialization. Friedman would not touch capital theory. And that's why. No, I won't do that. I don't want to run over time. Does anybody have a question at all?
He said that he criticized inflation.
No, he sees the 20s as the golden years of the Fed.
So as long as that would
Yeah. Now he does say, in an interview, he says, I've got no doubt that the stock market crash had something to do with the downturn. That's as far as he went. But he didn't blame that run-up on monetary factors. And his co-author, Anna Schwartz, argued that prices weren't too high. The stock prices weren't too high, not even at their 29 peak. She said they were consistent with the fundamentals and would have continued on had the Fed not blundered and dropped the money supply. So the answer to your question is no, he did not worry about. And Friedman, when I've had correspondence with him, he was always quick to send me charts of money supply and price level and interest rates during the 20s, with the point that, yeah. Well, it is. It is, and it's a question of, it's a deep question about methodology. How do you go about doing theory? And again, Woods had a great talk yesterday where some people think you approach it without having a theory to start with, and others think you need some theory before you know what data to look for. Okay. Yeah, one more question.
You talk a lot about
It's a great. His greatest book was that 56 book on the capital and the structure. That's great. It sort of fleshes it out. And sure, I was using Hayek here almost as a abbreviation for the Austrians. I wasn't making a distinction. Mises got good stuff too, and Mises didn't ever draw a triangle. He never drew anything, and never argued in terms of the triangle, but argued in a way that was consistent with the triangle. All right, thank you very much.